Just do a little refresh. Here we go. Good to go.
Do you see it on your end?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Oh, nice. Awesome. Let's see. Going live.
Yeah, it's live on that too.
Waiting for it to pull up. Tanner, do you want to share it in the Slack over there?
Sure.
That'd be great. I'll wait for some people to start joining here.
I wonder if I can prop this up.
There it is. Finally. All right, we got 24 people here so far, and it's climbing steadily. So we're stoked. How's it going, everybody? If you're just joining the live stream, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're coming from. Good morning, Nora. It's great to see you again. For those of you who've joined, Nora is a rock star. She's awesome. She actually did a bunch of clips of the sessions yesterday, and we're going to be sharing those over social media here over the course of the day. 35 people in. What's happening, Christopher? Good to see you, brother. Good morning, Nikita. Hello, and good morning to you as well. Everyone, we've got Austin Belcak with us today, and so excited to hear from him. He's got some sweet tips to share with you around landing a job without applying online. And so get excited for that. Before we jump in, you can see a lot of people joining here. Before we dive in, I wanted to send a shout out to the organizing committee of the Get Hired Summit. We have Utah Women in Sales, the Utah Black Chamber, the Diversity Career Fair, Rev Road, which is actually the accelerator program that we're a part of, and Mentally, our company, that have banded together to put this on. And a little bit of history on the event while people are joining. Back in April, beginning of April, we heard about the pandemic and everything that was going on, and we just saw this massive wave of unemployment coming. And so we wanted to be a part of the solution. We started racking our brains around how we could help. And the idea came, why don't we do a virtual career fair? Knowing absolutely squat about doing a virtual career fair. And so we said, hey, let's just set the date 3 weeks from now and see what happens. Well, we couldn't have expected the response. We had 5,000 people sign up for that first virtual career fair within 3 weeks. And Austin came last time, Madeline Mann came, and just a ton of employers to help people land jobs. And so we sat down afterwards, and it was just this cool experience. And we said, why don't we do this again? Let's give ourselves a little bit more time this time to put it together. And so we set the date for August 13th and 14th, and we started working towards it. And now, for those of you who are joining, many of you will know, obviously, Austin's here, Madeline's here again. We've got other speakers like Ashley Watkins. We've got Brittany Crystal, Quentin alums that have all come to share their deep knowledge of finding a job and branding yourself in a way that can set you up for success. They've come to share that. We've also had companies like Starbucks, like Lucid, like Adobe. I'm trying to go through the list in my head here. Just so many amazing employers that have come through to hire and run information sessions. If you're joining, oh my goodness, I'm losing track of the comments here. Good morning, everyone. Delia, yay, Austin. Good morning from San Diego. If you guys are just joining, let us know where you're tuning in from. Would be sweet to see that. Yesterday we did this crazy game where we put you on the spot, and we said, what connection do you have with this random place that somebody's joining from? But today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm working out a kiln, and if you will notice, I'm wearing this sweet kiln t-shirt over here. And they have actually sponsored the Get Hired Summit and have sponsored this incredible box of t-shirts just like mine. So if you want one of these t-shirts, we've got 20 of them to give away. Check it out. Take a good look. We'll send it to you in the mail, wherever you are. We want to know, what's the weirdest or craziest place you've ever worked out of? So you see the kiln connection there. What is the weirdest or craziest place you've ever worked out of? Keep it kosher. Chris, the weirdest place you've ever worked out of was Nashville?
I saw that too.
I guess that is kind of a crazy place. Kansas City, Missouri. It looks like people, I want the box. She's tuning in. She's one of the career coaches for the Get Hired Summit. So while those are two, while people are going ahead and saying the craziest place that they've ever worked from, I'm going to introduce Austin. So guys, if you do not know Austin, you need to get to know this guy. He is incredible. I've been following him for a while now, since a little bit before the first Get Hired Summit, and I've just been blown away. To give you an example, I worked at LinkedIn, so we had touch with a lot of different career coaches and thought leaders around finding a job. And what I found was a lot of them gave the same advice over and over again, and a lot of good advice, but there was nothing really innovative coming up. And if you go and look at Austin's websites, he takes a completely different approach than what most people do. And this approach has been known to work tons of times. What I love about Austin as well is that it's worked for him multiple times over. So now you landed your job at Microsoft, right? From implementing the strategies that you're teaching everyone on your website and through the emails that you send out. And so if you haven't yet, go and sign up for Austin's email list. It's free, and he'll give you some incredible insights. I want to hand it over to you, Austin, and if you could give people a little bit more color and background on what you're about and what you do, and then we'll let you get into it.
Yeah, Luke, I really appreciate it, man. First off, thanks again for putting on such an awesome summit. I had so many people hit me up last time saying, one, I liked your session, but more than that, the whole Get Hired experience was awesome. And there's a lot of virtual summits out there, but you guys have done a killer job, especially, as you said, not knowing squat when you jumped in. So, huge kudos to you all. I'm super happy to be back. And yeah, by way of intro, your introduction was super generous. For everybody on the line who doesn't know me, like Luke said, my name's Austin Belcak, and I really do two things. So during the day, 9 to 5, I work at Microsoft, and I'm a director of partnerships there. I've been there for about 5 years. I started off as a partner manager and then worked my way up. And that job is essentially, what enabled me to start this side hustle, which is a company called Cultivated Culture. So Cultivated Culture was started about 4 years after about 4 months after I joined Microsoft. And the whole goal was to teach people the system that I'd created for finding jobs without applying online. So again, it's been around for 4 years. We have right now about 400,000 people in the Cultivated Culture community, all job searchers, like many of you who are, looking to make some sort of jump. And we really specialize in helping people who are coming from a bit of a non-traditional background. So maybe, you didn't go to the Ivy League college, or you didn't have the best grades, or you're trying to make a total industry pivot and you don't have, all that on paper experience. That's really a big focus of what we do, because, it's really hard to know what you want in your career, whether you're just starting out or even sometimes when you're midway through, or even, on the later half of your career. We change, we evolve, right? And so what we do at Cultivated Culture is essentially teach people how to land jobs without traditional experience and without applying online. So our strategies have been featured in places like Forbes and Business Insider, Inc., Fast Company, USA Today, you name it. And those same strategies have helped people get hired at the world's best companies: Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, so on and so forth. If you can think of a logo or a Fortune 500 company, we've helped somebody get a job there. So first off, I'd love to hear from everybody in the comments, what you feel is the most frustrating part of landing a job or the job search process in today's market. And what I'm going to do is share a little bit more about my background and sort of, why I'm even qualified to be sitting here and what my story is all about, because I started in the same place that many of you are probably at, which was, feeling totally lost, feeling super frustrated with the hiring process and really not knowing what to do next. So I'd love to hear from you all in the comments what you feel like the most frustrating part of the job search process is. And I will, while you guys are commenting, I will take you back to, I think high school is the best place to start. So when I was in high school, I was pushed by a lot of people to kind of tell them what I was going to do when I grow up. And this is something that a lot of us are asked, right? From the moment you can walk and talk, people are like, what do you want to be when you grow up? But, when you're 5 or 4 or whatever, you can say, I want to be Cristiano Ronaldo, or I want to be an astronaut or whatever. And everybody's like, you can do it. Like, you can do anything you put your mind to. But then we get older, right? And the scope of realistic answers or acceptable answers gets smaller. And that scope gets smaller, but we're not really given the tools to explore and to expand and see what's really out there. So I feel like a lot of us get funneled into these like quote TV careers, right? Like you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're an accountant, you work in finance, all these careers that we see that are sort of traditional and that are placed out there in front of us. And those aren't always a good fit, but they're what we know. And so that's the trap that I sort of fell into. My parents were asking me what I wanted to do, friends, professors. So I just said, doctor, because I took a biology course. I thought it was interesting. I got the nods of approval, right? And so I basically set up my whole college search around the pre-med track. So my goal when I got to college was to be a doctor, but I also went to boarding school, and we didn't get out much in boarding school. So now all of a sudden I'm in this college environment where there's a ton of other people who are my age, and there aren't any parents, there aren't really any rules. You just kind of have to show up for class and get your grades, and that's really all that's expected of you at a bare minimum. And so I quickly found that to be a lot more fun than sitting in the library and studying. And my grades suffered as a result. So I immediately failed chemistry my freshman year, fall semester, and then I failed French the spring semester of my freshman year. And there aren't many doctors accepting people who immediately fail 2 classes out of the gate, right? So I basically was faced with a choice. Do I slog it out and try to drag my GPA up to like a semi-acceptable level and continue going to med school? Do I try to explore and find something else, or do I just kind of coast and enjoy the fun parts of college? And that's the route that I chose. I didn't want to stick with the doctor stuff because that really at the end of the day wasn't what excited me. I wasn't really willing to get out there and explore the other options because I didn't really know what else was out there. So I just enjoyed the rest of college. And fast forward to junior year, I got an internship that was just kind of dumped into my lap. And my roommate's dad, just hooked me up with this guy, went and interned for them. They offered me a job. I accepted it sight unseen. I didn't really think about cost of living or salary or anything else. And I just coasted the rest of senior year. And then graduation came, and I essentially got slapped in the face because I hadn't done any work. I hadn't applied to one single other company, hadn't interviewed anywhere else. And this job was miserable. So I, first off, was waking up at 3 a.m, roughly 6 days a week to go drive to these different hospitals that were 2 hours away in order to be there by the time surgery started at 6 a.m. because I was in medical device sales. But then on top of that, my boss treated me like crap. He kept saying, you don't have a future in this space. You're not good enough. You're never going to make it. You're not cutting it. And that was really frustrating as well. And then on top of that, I just wasn't being paid enough. So I was making around $35,000-$40,000 a year. And given where I was at with my rent and my car payment and all this stuff that I just needed to get by, that chewed up like 70 to 80% of my expenses. And there wasn't much left to live on after that. So I racked up $15,000 of credit card debt in the next couple of months, shortly after graduating. So all in all, pretty miserable situation, right? And so my boss kept telling me, you should do something else. You should do something else. So finally I said, you know what? I'm going to do something else. And I looked at what was out there. This was back in 2013. And this was Facebook's hitting its stride. Google was the juggernaut that it always has been. It was sort of like the golden age of tech, I would say. A lot of, the implications of some of this data stuff and other practices hadn't quite come out yet. And everything, was just, it looked amazing, right? All these people were my age. They were doing really well, working at these cool companies and cool places. And I said, that's what I want to do. I want to work for a Google or a Microsoft or whatever it was. And I went and told, people, and they laughed at me. They're like, okay, just to clarify, you're the kid with the 2.58 GPA, the biology degree, 3 months of professional experience, and you want to work at Google, right? Like, I didn't hear that wrong. And then they just kind of laughed and like brushed it off. So I said, well, everybody's told me if I went to college and I got a degree, I should be able to get my foot in the door somewhere. That's why I paid all this money, right? And so I went to all these people, same people we always go to for advice, right? Parents, friends, college counselors, whether it's, career services or professors, the internet. And they all told me the same thing. They told me to tweak my resume, tweak my cover letter, apply online, and then that it was a numbers game, right? So the more apps you send out, the better chance you have of hearing back. So I said, great, I can do that. And that's exactly what I did. For the first month, I applied to 100 places and I didn't hear back at all. So no interviews, no offers, no nothing. So I went back to the same people and I was like, what gives? Like, what the heck is going on? You told me this was the way and nothing is coming out of this. Like, am I doing something wrong? Is something wrong with me? And they're like, no. You just got to keep doing it. It's a numbers game. So that's what I did. But I was a little skeptical. And I said, all right, I will double down, because if you guys are saying this is the way, I'm going to just go all in. And if it doesn't work, something is up and something has to change. And that's exactly what happened. So I ended up applying to 200 places over the next month, and same result, smattering of interviews, mostly pity interviews from family, friends, 0 offers. Everybody would tell me, hey, we really like you, Austin, but we have candidates who, actually have real experience. So we're going to have to go with them. And that was super frustrating. And so the definition of insanity is essentially doing the same thing over and over again and expecting, a different result. And this felt insane. Like, this felt crazy, because all the people that I know and trusted, they were telling me to do this process, and the process was not working. And there was no feedback, right? The worst part about it was that, if I'm baking a cake, I know that if I put in, a teaspoon of salt, or I put in a half cup of salt, I know how salty that cake is going to be. But in the job search process, if I submit 1 application or 10 applications or 200 applications, I could not tell you confidently how many interviews I would get out of that. It's not unrealistic to say that I would get 0, because that's exactly what happened to me. And so it's really frustrating because we don't get any feedback. We don't understand where to improve or how to iterate. And it's just such a frustrating process. So around that same time, I was in a pretty bad place. I didn't know what to do. All these people I trusted for advice were giving me this information that wasn't working. And around that same time, I went and had coffee with an alumni from the university that I went to, and he was working at Uber. And he basically said something along the lines of, look, Austin, you're talking to all these people who may be successful in their own right, parents, friends, et cetera, but none of them have done what you want to do. Like, none of them have worked at Google, have worked at Microsoft, and none of them have done that coming from a non-traditional background. So he was like, if you want to be successful, you need to go find other people who have already walked this path, and you need to talk to them. And so distilling that down a little bit more eloquently, my wife has done this recently, and she basically said, he's basically saying you should only take advice from people who already have what you want. And that was a light bulb moment for me. So I took that traditional process and I threw it out the window, and I said, I'm going to start from scratch. So I wrote down the 4 criteria of my dream job. I basically said, I want to be working at a Google or a Microsoft, the leading tech company. I want to be working in a big city, New York, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, et cetera. I want to be making, a certain level of income, and I want to be doing it before the age of 25. And so I went to LinkedIn and I found all of these people who met that criteria. I looked at their titles. I used Glassdoor to look up their salary, and I tried to hone in on people who also came from a non-traditional background. And then I just reached out to them, and, I just asked them to get on the phone to learn more about their experience. And I just peppered them with questions to understand what this process was like for them, how they overcame some of these obstacles, how they pitched themselves, what they did. There were really 2 core themes that came out of those conversations. And so the first was almost every single person, like we're talking 99% of the people that I talked to, had gotten a referral into the job that they were currently in. So that was the first light bulb for me. Most of them had not applied online for these roles. The second light bulb was that many of them went above and beyond to illustrate their experience in some way. They didn't just rely on a resume or a cover letter to illustrate their value. And so both of those things were really interesting to me because they made sense. And I felt like I had a little bit more control. If I could say, hey, Luke is the person who I want to get in touch with. I want a job at Mentorly, let's say, let me specifically focus on building a relationship with him. And if I can get referred in by, one of the founders or somebody who's the potential hiring manager, I'll be in really, really good shape. And I'd also seen that, in the cases with my friends or other people, if you know somebody at the company and they refer you in, you usually don't have to apply online, right? And so that was even more attractive. I was like, if I can circumvent this whole online applicant tracking system stuff, like that would be a huge win, because I think that's a big part of what's holding me back. So I essentially took those two core concepts and started testing. I experimented like crazy. And my whole goal was to tear apart the hiring process and understand how it worked at every step, and understand how I could leverage those two basically core pillars for myself. And so I did that for a while. I interviewed and applied and kind of reached out to hundreds. I reached out to thousands of people. I talked to hundreds. I interviewed at a ton of different companies. And I basically took all of the data, and then I consolidated it into this system, which I then eventually used to get in the door with Microsoft and Google and Twitter. And then I accepted the offer from Microsoft, and here we are. So that system is what I want to talk about for the rest of this session. How do you get in the door at these companies without having to submit an online application? So the biggest thing here is that we just need to take a step back, and we need to think about the reason why companies hire. And we also need to think about the investments that certain people have. So at the end of the day, companies hire candidates that they believe will give them the most ROI or the most value for their return on their investment in that employee, which is essentially a salary. So they're basically looking across all the spectrum of candidates, and they're saying, okay, which one of these people, if we pay them X dollars in salary, which one of them is going to bring us the largest return? And there's a number of different criteria, right? Like obviously revenue is a big one, but culture is another big one. And, lifting other people up, leadership, there's a lot of buckets that these companies look at, but at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. And so when we strip everything else away, getting hired isn't necessarily about having the best resume that beats the applicant tracking system. And it's not necessarily about having a great cover letter. And it's not necessarily about a lot of this stuff that we're told. Really, at the end of the day, it's convincing the person with the most influence that we are the best candidate. And so now we've opened up a lot of routes, because we don't just have to rely on that traditional route. And the big problem with the traditional process is that I see so many candidates focusing in on the wrong stuff. So, I post on LinkedIn every day, and I look through the feeds and the comments, and I see these posts that are like, guys, if you have a horizontal line in your resume, like you are not going to get hired. Or like if you use like size 11 times New Roman font, look out, because you are getting thrown right in the trash. And like, guys, let's be real. Like if you're not getting hired, it's not because you use times 11 size or times New Roman size 11, right? It's because there's a disconnect between the value that the employer is looking for and what you are illustrating. And so what this comes down to is a couple of things. One, people are not great at selling themselves. And there's a number of reasons for that. And that's totally fine. And I'll kind of walk you through that. But on top of that, the medium through which we convey our value it just doesn't make sense, right? So we think about, it's this 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. In many cases, it's, black and white. Some people add color, graphics, whatever. But most cases, it's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of black and white paper. And then on top of that, we use this like super weird language that we never use anywhere else, right? Like nobody talks the way that we write on a resume. Nobody even writes the way that we write on a resume. It's like a legal document in the sense that we only use that language within that one document. And so this is essentially like, if two people showed up at a bar and pre-COVID or socially distanced, whatever you want. And both of them, they were from different countries and English was their third language. And they're trying to have a super serious conversation about, a $100,000 to $200,000 deal. A lot of stuff is going to get lost in translation because the person who is pitching is not used to pitching in this language. And the person who's listening is not used to receiving this information in this language. And that's just a recipe for disaster. Then on top of that, our resume is basically the antithesis of good sales. So I work in sales, and the thing you learn on day one is, if you want to be a great salesperson, you need to make your pitch about your audience, about the person sitting across the table from you. But a resume only lets you talk about you and your past, right? There's no room to say, hey, I've done research on your company, or, here's where I think I can add value to this specific role. We basically say like, hey, here's the list of stuff that I've done. And, I hope that you figure out how that's, helpful to you. And that's just not a good way to sell. So what we need to do is, and don't get me wrong, having a great resume, having a great cover letter is still a very, very core part of the job search process. And investing in those things is important. But the big mistake that people make is that, one, they only invest in those things, and two, they over-index in that investment. And so what I mean by that is, one, most job seekers that I see, they spend so much time applying for jobs online. Typically, the ratio is like 90% of their time is spent applying for jobs online, and 10% of the time is spent networking, building relationships. And then on top of that, like, of that 90%, it's all like tweaking the resume, right? And, keywords, and should I use size 11 or 12, or everything we talked about. And so when we look at the data, that just doesn't make sense, because in terms of applying online, basically what happens is when you submit a resume, you're basically in a pool of 300 to 350 applications. The average role out there gets around 300 to 350 applications. And then the ATS screens your resume, the applicant tracking system. Recruiters go in and they type in their keywords and stuff like that. And they basically pull out 4 to 6 candidates. So if you do the math, that's a sub 2% chance of getting in the door just for an interview. But then if we look at the flip side, if we look at referrals make up anywhere from 40% to 80% of hires. And so 40% is the most conservative estimate I've seen, and 80% is on the higher end. So even if you put it at 60 in the middle there, that's a pretty significant amount of hires, but only 7% of candidates are coming in via referral. So why is this important? Well, when you apply online, you are competing with 75% of other candidates for a 2% chance of getting in the door. Whereas if you target those referrals, you're competing with 7% of job seekers for 60% of the roles that are available. So just think about that. When you apply online, you are making an investment in something that has terrible odds. So why do we do that? Well, it's because it's not easy, comfortable, or familiar to start building relationships. So that's where this process kind of comes in. Our big goal is to shift our focus away from the online apps. You can still do them. You just want to be efficient about it. I want you to spend 10 to 20% of your time on the online apps. I want you to spend 80 to 90% of your time building relationships. And so what we're going to do here, and just to kind of walk through the process, we're going to start with a list of target companies. So when you apply online, you're typically just throwing applications out there. So I know Luke Madeline Mann gave a great session, it sounds like, in the comments here. And she basically has this great term where she calls it hitchhiking through your job search. And I don't know if she mentioned it on her session, but essentially what she's saying is when you apply online, you're basically sticking your thumb out there with your application. You hope that you get picked up, right? The problem with that is, like, why do none of us want to hitchhike? Like, well, because we don't want to get picked up by the serial killer, right? And then like end up in a ditch on the side of the road. And you're basically playing roulette with your career when you just throw online applications out there and cross your fingers that somebody gets back to you. But at the same time, we feel like there isn't a better way. So the core part of this, and the first step here, is to say, okay, instead of spraying applications out across 100 companies, let me pick 10 to 15 dream companies. Let me pick 10 to 15 companies that I am super excited about. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the energy that you would have spent, tweaking your resume and doing all this other stuff for hundreds of companies, and we're just going to focus it in on 10 to 15 companies. So that is the starting point. And how you pick those companies is really up to you. We could spend a lot of time on where to find them and how to, prioritize your criteria and all that. I will leave that up to you. And I also have some resources on my site about that. But once we have our 10 to 15 companies, our next step is to go find contacts. So what we're going to do is we're going to go try to find the person who has the most influence over our ability to get hired. So a big mistake that a lot of people make is that they go for the obvious person, right? So, Luke's face is posted next to a role on LinkedIn, and everybody's like, oh, I'm going to do what Austin said. I'm going to reach out to somebody. And then they send Luke an email. Well, yeah, you and 7,000 other job seekers had that same idea. And all of a sudden, like, Luke's deleted his inbox because it's blown up and gone crazy. And that's the reality for most recruiters. If you talk to them, they get hundreds and hundreds of messages from people just like you who are thinking they're a little bit smarter because they're reaching out to a human. And in reality, it's just really hard to get in touch with them. But even if you do get in touch with them, your chances of influence or the amount of influence that you get through that is fairly low. Like they can get you in the door for an interview, but they don't really have a huge influence over the final hiring decision, right? And so none of this is to disparage recruiters in any way. I mean, you guys are doing phenomenal work, and like I can't even imagine being like so inundated with so many people sending you the same, like, here's my resume, help me out. And like, you guys are doing amazing work. But from a job seeker's perspective, it's just not always worth your time as a job seeker. And you actually may be saving the recruiter some time by taking this route. But if you target somebody who might be your manager if you got hired, or your colleague with the same job title who'd be sitting next to you on your team, that person, one, is getting way less email, and two, has way more influence over over your ability to get hired. And so that's really who we want to focus in on. So what we're going to do is we're going to go use LinkedIn to find 10 to 15 people at each of our target companies. So just to recap, we have 10 to 15 target companies and 10 to 15 people at each of those companies. So at a minimum, we're looking at around 150 contacts. And that number is not an accident. It sounds like a lot, and it's actually not. If you send 10 emails a day, you're going to blow through it in 2 weeks and you'll be good to go. I would recommend probably sending a smaller volume of email every day. We'll talk about that. But that 150 number basically is what I've seen as the number that will swing the odds in your favor. Because what happens is if we start with the offer and we reverse engineer the process, this is where that control piece comes in. This is where you can take some more control over the process. And so what I'm talking about is if you look at every step in the job search process and you assign success rates to every step, what you can do is, one, get some insight into where things are going well and where things are not going well. And then you can improve based on that. So let's say that your success rate from final round interview to offer is 33%. And let's say that you want 2 offers because you want some options, you want to be able to negotiate. So that means if you have a 33% success rate there, you need 6 final round interviews to get those 2 offers. Now, not every first round interview you go on is going to result in a final round, right? So there's some attrition there and we need to bake that in. So let's say your success rate is also 33% here. That means you need 18 first round interviews to get those 6 final rounds to get those 2 offers. And not everybody would talk to you. The hope is that those 18 referrals, 18 to 20, let's say, to make it easy, most of them should be coming from referrals. You may get 1 or 2 or 3 from online apps, and that's awesome. Again, we're not advocating for not applying online whatsoever. We're just advocating for spending way less time doing that. But you may drum up some opportunities through that, and that's fantastic. But the vast majority of those should be coming through referrals, which means you need to have conversations, right? Not everybody, or you can't get the referral without a conversation. So we need to reach out to we need to talk to a certain number of people. And that tends to be in the ballpark of 30 to 50 conversations. Now, when I say 30 to 50 conversations, people usually are like, oh my God, a 30-minute Zoom call times 50 people, that's so much time. Like, how do I do that? A conversation isn't necessarily a 30-minute Zoom call. It can be, but it can also be, back and forth exchange on LinkedIn, or it can be swapping some emails. There's a lot of ways to build relationships in today's world. And so that suddenly becomes a lot easier when we think about it that way. So I just want to note that. But 30 to 50 conversations will put you in a really good spot to get those 18 first rounds, 6 final rounds, 2 offers. But not everybody we reach out to is going to get back to us, right? So when you start out, you can expect like a 10 to 15% response rate on your cold emails or your cold outreach. But as you follow up and as you get better and as you test your emails, you can raise that response rate into like the 25 to 30% range. So using those numbers, if we need 30 to 50 conversations and we go 50 to be conservative, and we stick with, let's say 30% response rate on email, that means we need to hit up 150 people to kind of work through that whole funnel, right? So the biggest thing I want to note here is that you should do this, but keep track of your own metrics, because what you're going to be able to do is 2 things. 1, you'll be able to see where things are breaking down and where you need to improve. But then 2, my assumption is whatever job you're looking for now is not going to be your last job. You're going to do the job search again. And so you're going to be able to do yourself a huge favor if you just look at your sheet and you say, okay, here are my success rates. So I feel pretty confident that if I reach out to, maybe for you, it's 179 people or whatever it is, I feel confident that based on my old rates, I should be in a good place to get an offer. So again, you just put yourself statistically in a much better position here. So we have our 10 to 15 companies. We have our 10 to 15 people at each. The next step is to research these companies. And this is where a lot of people fall short. So what I found is that the people who are willing to help are going to be willing to help, but the level at which they help is dependent on the level that you show up. So if I show up and I'm like, hey, Luke, what's a day in your life look like? If you're willing to help me, you'll tell me, and that's cool. Is that really furthering the relationship and showing off my value? Maybe, maybe not, most likely not. But if I show up and I say, hey, Luke, I was doing some research on your company, on Mentorly, and I was looking at some of the competitors here, and it seems like this thing is really, really working well for them. But I noticed you guys haven't done that. Is that because you've tested it out and it didn't work, or is there some obstacle, or have you just not gotten around to it? Yeah, I'm super curious. And just for context, this is something that I help companies with, or I've helped my previous company with. So I'm happy to bounce some ideas around. Well, now all of a sudden, Luke's like, whoa, you did a competitive analysis. Like, you've invested time in learning about me. And that was a really good question. I'm much more likely, or Luke's much more likely, to give you more info and view you as more credible, and probably have, a little bit more respect in a professional sense. Not that anybody's going to not respect you as a person, but the big thing here is if you, I think one of my favorite people, her name's Amy Volas on LinkedIn. She summed it up really well. She basically said, if you want 15 minutes of my time, show me that you spent 15 minutes to get it. Show me you spent 15 minutes to earn the 15 minutes of my time. So that's the mindset that I want you to have. And that really comes from researching these companies. So some of the ways to research companies that I really like, listening to earnings calls. So every public company out there has to report out on their earnings. So if you just go type in the company name and then investor relations or earnings calls, you should be able to pull those up. And when you listen to them, the company talks about where they are, how they performed over the last quarter, where they're going over the next 6 to 12 months, what challenges they're facing, all this stuff that we care about. Another way that I love researching companies is listening to keynotes or interviews with executives. And if you can dial into an executive that is kind of in your purview, if you wanted to work at Amazon Web Services, let's say, a guy named Andy Jassy is the CEO of Amazon Web Services specifically. So maybe more relevant to listen to him than something from Jeff, if you will. So listening to those interviews is going to give you a lot of information as well. And then what you can do is show up in these conversations and you can say stuff like, hey, and you can even do this in your outreach as well, but you can say, hey, I was listening to this keynote that Andy gave at, whatever talk. And he mentioned, this specific initiative that you guys are coming out with, but also in the earnings call, it sounded like, X and Y may be a potential challenge to that. How are you guys solving for that? And, if I may, this is the type of stuff that I do at my current company. So would be happy to bounce ideas around. Well, now all of a sudden you're showing that you've done your research, you really invested time up front. You're going to get a higher response rate. You're going to get better results from these conversations. So doing your research before you reach out to people is really, really critical. And my recommendation, once you get to this point, is to kind of basically go through a cycle of research 3 companies and then reach out to the 10 to 15 people at those 3 companies, and then rinse and repeat. Because if you try to research, it takes it takes 5 to 10 hours to research a company really, really thoroughly, really, really well. And if you're like, oh, that sounds like a lot, it just means that you're not researching companies thoroughly enough, especially when we're only targeting 10 to 15. So that's the type of level of investment that we're making. But if you did that for 15 companies, you would forget, by the time you got to company 5, you'd forget what happened to company 1. So you want to go out there and you basically want to rinse and repeat cycle between these 3 companies, reach out to those people, and then go on to the next 3 companies, and then reach out to people at the next 3 companies. So that's where we start. And again, if you send out 150 emails, what I'd recommend doing is coming up with 3 different templates, or even 2 different templates, and then send each template to 20 people and reflect back and say, okay, which one of these did the worst? Let me delete that and let me add in a new template. And these can be fundamentally different approaches. I always like to have the initial set include the email where you say, hey, Luke, I saw you're hiring at Mentorly. Here's my resume. Can you help me out? Because I always just want people to see what the data actually looks like when you send that email, because that's the most common email that people send. And it tends to have really bad response rates. But then people come to me and they're like, well, what if I'm not direct? Or what if I don't say what I want? Or how will they know I want the role? I promise you that if you make the outreach about the other person, you are going to get way higher response rates and way better results. But the only way you're going to see that is if you keep the data for yourself. And that improvement, this testing, this, send 20 emails across 3 templates, delete the last one, add in a new one, rinse and repeat. That's where you improve your response rate. So you send these emails out, you're going to book your, 30 to 50 back and forths in some capacity. And then through those conversations, you should be able to land a referral. Now, the way that we go about this, And once you start landing these conversations, essentially what we want to do in the conversations is we want to learn from the person that we're talking to. We want to ask them about their backgrounds. We want to make sure that they get to talk about themselves. But then we want to ask some leading questions that allow us to dig up some more info. You did your research at a high level, right? You listened to the interviews, the earnings calls, you read the articles. But this person is in a unique position to give you some more info about, what's going on with that team or in their specific space. So let's leverage that high level research that you did, and let's use it with these people to extract information that's at that team cut level, right? So you understand, hey, this is a specific challenge that this team is having. How can I solve for that? Or this is a specific initiative that this team is rolling out. How can I add value to that? That's going to really be where the magic happens. And so you have this conversation and you get that information. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go put together something that I call a value validation project. So a value validation project really plays into the thing that we talked about before, just demonstrating that you are the most valuable candidate. Because what this does, and I guess the definition of a value validation project, which would be the most helpful thing to share first, is the VVP is essentially a deliverable. It could be a deck. Deck tends to be the easiest, but it depends on your role. If you want to get a job in production, maybe it's a video. If you want to be a graphic designer, maybe it's some design work that you do. If you're a software engineer, maybe you code up something easy but helpful. It's essentially a project or a deliverable that shows, one, you've done your research on the company. Two, you understand where they're going with this role, why they're hiring for this role, whether it's to solve for a challenge or whether it's to drive a specific initiative or reach a certain goal. And then you share ideas or feedback or whatever it is that basically shows, this is the type of work that I would do if you took a chance on me. And the reason this is so effective, and I'll give an example of it, but the reason this is so effective is because everybody else out there is still relying on that same old stuff, right? Another resume. Oh, another team player that's highly motivated. Great. Oh, this person, and the 10 other people have great attention to detail. Like, awesome stuff, guys. Well, you're showing up and you're saying, yeah, I'll show you my attention to detail and my motivation in this deck, in this project that I put together. And so the VVP tends to play really, really well because, one, it demonstrates everything we just talked about. So if you refer or send it back to the person who might refer you in, that contact, and you say, hey, I thought about that challenge. Luke, you and I talked, and all of your competitors have a proactive chatbot on their site, but you don't. Well, I went and put together a whole analysis on, which chatbot you guys should use, some case studies on why it would be effective, and here's how you might implement it. Feel free to take it or leave it. And, oh, by the way, I'm also potentially, and I wouldn't. So the big thing I want to note is I usually don't recommend mentioning that you're looking for a job right off the bat. You sort of want to incept it through adding enough value. The rule of reciprocity is really, really strong in all of us. And typically, if I keep showing up and adding value, the person's going to say, well, what can I do for you? And then you say, well, I happen to be in the market. And, if you like what you saw, maybe you could keep me in mind for some opportunities. But essentially what we're doing is we're providing this thing and we're saying, I hope this is valuable. And then we lead into that ask at a certain point, and we should be in really good shape because this person should have we should have a bit of a rapport, and they should see the value that we bring to the table. And that's a really deadly combo. Once you get in the interview, you also have this entire thing that you can point to and speak to. So everybody else is over here and they're like, ooh, tell me about a time that I failed. Okay, I'll tell you about that. And you're like, here's the thing, guys. You have this challenge and I basically solved for it. So let's talk about that. This is what you really care about. And we dive right into that. And you're basically acting like a consultant almost, showing them some ways that they can improve or giving them some data that they may not have or may not, have sourced on their own or whatever it is. And so that tends to be a great conversation starter. And this is really critical for people coming from a non-traditional background for two reasons. One, it eliminates the fact that when people say, oh, we don't know if they could do the job because they don't have enough experience. Well, you're basically showing them that you can do the job. So you don't have to worry about that. But then two, it shifts the conversation away from your non-traditional background and towards this deck, this thing that you put together that's super valuable. So now we don't have to focus on or talk about the thing that all of us hate talking about the most. And we get to focus on exactly what you bring to the table, which is the thing that you do want to talk about. So the value validation project tends to be really, really effective. And to give you an example of what one of those looks like, I was working with somebody who was a student out of the University of Washington, and she wanted a rotational marketing role at Microsoft. So at the time we said, okay, how can we show up with a lot of value here? Well, let's go find a product that Microsoft has that could use like a little bit of love in the marketing space. So essentially what we did was we looked across the whole Microsoft product suite, and we found Microsoft Teams. And this was pre-COVID. This was, pre all this crazy stuff. And Teams was struggling a little bit compared to Slack, its largest competitor. So basically what she did was she went out and she surveyed a ton of users who use Microsoft Office and Teams, who also use Slack. She read through a ton of reviews, and she put together 3 ways that teams could increase their market share. So just to share one, she basically said, okay, Microsoft has 155 million Office users. And one of the most frustrating things is when you try to send a PowerPoint presentation that's too large to email. How do I do that? Well, what if PowerPoint was smart enough to have a pop-up that said, hey, I'm too big to email. Well, why don't you try sending me through Teams? And so now I send it through Teams to Luke, and maybe Luke types back to me, hey, thanks for sending, I'll take a look. And then he says, oh, there's a typo on slide 10. Well, what are we doing? We're having a conversation over Teams, which is exactly our goal, right? So we're putting Teams in front of these people in a way where it benefits them to use it, and hopefully we get some adoption that way. So that was just one idea. She had 3 of them. Long story short, that's what all of her interviewers focused on. And everybody else was competing on their resume and their interview questions. And she was showing up with this thing that everybody was super interested in. She went on to get the offer as a direct result of putting that together. And she beat out, there's tons of competition for this role. So that's the power that a value validation project can have. So I think we're coming up on time here. And so I basically just want to send you guys home with one message. The biggest takeaway here is, one, working those referrals is going to be, it's probably uncomfortable. It's probably unfamiliar. It is so worth it to step outside of your comfort zone because of what the data shows us. But then on top of that, I want you to start thinking about these roles and qualifications as an equation. You may not have a marketing degree, but you want a marketing role. But that doesn't really matter, because in the hiring manager's mind, they're looking for, marketing degree is maybe worth 3 points of value. So all you need to do is find another way to add 3 points of value through a value validation project, through, some other form. And if you do that, you're not going to have to worry about, oh, they're asking for 5 years and I only have 3, or they're asking for this thing and I have a non-traditional background. Like, you are going to blow people away. And one of the main reasons you're going to do that too is because nobody else is doing this. So I hope this was helpful. That is basically as much as we can pack into this session. But if you guys have any questions, I don't know, Luke, if we have time for Q&A, but there's a ton of resources on my site. People were asking about the value validation project stuff. If you go to cultivatedculture.com/value, there's an entire article on value validation projects, so you guys can dive in there. But Luke, I'll stop there, and yeah, thank you so much.
Austin, thank you so much. If you're in the comments right now, I need you to all go there and do a little emoji, clap emoji, because that was absolutely incredible. Seriously, there was just so much packed in there that I'm just over here freaking taking notes and trying to think about how to apply it into what we do over at Mentally. So thank you so much, Austin. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. I want to tell you this. We have Pinterest doing an information session right now. If you just go to the Mentally YouTube channel, you'll see them live. We have YouTube, Rev one of our Get Hired organizers, that are also going in and talking to you a little bit more about if you're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, maybe you've lost your job, you want to take a shift in your career, they're going to be talking to you about that. And then last but not least, we also have Fivetran, exactly. An exciting startup, just got massive funding, and they're hiring like crazy, invested in diversity and inclusion, such a cool company to work for. So if you want to start getting some FaceTime with them, doing some of that research that Austin was just talking about, this is the place to start, is this session right here. So jump off, stop listening to me. We're going to go out and send all of these t-shirts to the people who wrote the craziest place that they've worked out of in the chat. And we'll reach out to you on the Slack channel that way. But Austin, again, thank you so much. That was incredible. So helpful, and really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to all these good folks.
Of course. Thanks so much, Luke. I appreciate you having me.
You bet. We'll chat to you next time. See you guys.
Sounds good. See you later.